The envelope had no return address. Just my name, Elaine Harper, scrawled in an all too familiar, rigid hand. The kind of handwriting that used to label my report cards before they were taped to the fridge or to the trash. I almost threw it out with the rest of the junk mail. Almost. But something in the way the paper felt made my fingertips freeze. Thick, weighty, like it was carrying the final word in a language I'd spent 10 years trying to forget. I opened it slowly, my breath caught halfway through tearing the seal, like my body already knew what I was about to see. A funeral invitation. Thomas Harper Sr. was dead. I sat down without realizing it. The chair groaned beneath me, but I didn't move. I just stared at the paper, waiting to feel something. Grief, relief, anger, something. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant screech of a blue jay outside, and the voice in my head that whispered, "Why now?" 10 years. 10 whole years without a phone call, without a letter, without so much as a happy birthday card. 10 years since I stood on that man's porch, clutching my baby to my chest and begging for a place to stay. And he shut the door. "You made your bed," he said, cold as the December wind that night. "Now lie in it." That was the last thing I ever heard from my father. Until now. Mom. I turned. Mason stood in the hallway, his sketchbook still tucked under one arm, a smudge of graphite across his cheek. "You okay?" I tried to answer, but the lump in my throat pushed the words down. So I just handed him the paper. He read it slowly, then looked up at me. "Are you going?" I didn't reply. I couldn't. The weight of 10 silent years was heavier than any coffin. Then Mason stepped closer, his voice softer this time. Maybe he left more than just a will. "Mom." I stared at my son, the boy I had built my whole new life around. The one I kept safe, kept warm, kept loved when no one else would. And for the first time in years, something inside me moved. Not forgiveness, not hope, but curiosity. If there was anything left to be said, anything left for me to hear, I needed to hear it. I folded the letter carefully, packed 2 bags, and got ready to return to Baton Rouge, to the house where my name hadn't been spoken in a decade, to the family who erased me like a smudge on glass, to the man who may have died without ever saying sorry, or maybe not. It had been 10 years since I last saw the Harper family, 10 years since I left Baton Rouge behind with a busted lip and a baby strapped into the back seat of my rusted Honda. That night is burned into me, the gravel of my father's driveway crunching beneath my boots, the porch light flickering like it couldn't decide whether to welcome me or expose me, my fingers trembling as I knocked on the same door I'd once run through with skinned knees and spelling tests. But this time, I wasn't a little girl needing comfort. I was a grown woman with a split mouth, a black eye, and a child on my hip. And still, I knocked. When the door creaked open and I saw my father's face, stone carved into flesh, I felt my last thread of hope snap in two. "Elaine," he said flatly. No surprise, no concern, just my name, cold and hollow. "I just need a place to stay, just for a night." "Please," I whispered. Mason whimpered against my chest. My father didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask about the bruises or the suitcase full of baby clothes sitting behind me on the porch. He just stared. Then he said the words that would echo through my ribs for years. "You made your bed. Now lie in it." And he closed the door. I didn't cry that night. Not then. I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping Mason's car seat like it was the only thing anchoring me to this earth. We crossed the state line into Alabama just before sunrise, and I promised my son I would never let anyone treat us like we were disposable again. We started over in Mobile, in a tiny apartment above a laundromat. I took a job shelving books at the public library during the day and worked the front desk at a motel on weekends. It was quiet, unremarkable, but it was ours. Mason grew. He started drawing, birds mostly, cardinals, blue jays, red-tailed hawks. He said they made him feel less stuck, I understood that better than I ever admitted. I never spoke to my family again. Not Vanessa, with her designer shoes and venom-laced smile. Not Trevor, who always sided with Dad, even when silence hurt louder than words. And certainly not the man who brought me into this world and cast me out like a stain on his reputation. But despite everything, I sent money. Every month, through Mr. Walter Green, the retired electrician who lived next door to my father. Just enough to cover utilities, groceries. I didn't ask for thanks. I didn't even sign the envelopes. But I couldn't let the man freeze or starve, even if he'd let me do both. I told no one, not even Mason, because some debts aren't about morality. They're about decency. And even if he'd stopped being my father, I hadn't stopped being his daughter. The chapel looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown, taller, stronger, more wary. Wooden beams stretched overhead, worn from time and memory. Stained glass filtered dull Louisiana light across the pews, casting colors that felt more like bruises than blessings. I stepped through the double doors with Mason beside me, his hand tucked tightly into mine. It was the only thing in a room that felt real. Heads turned the moment we crossed the threshold, like someone had opened a door to a forgotten closet, and the dust had started to move again. Whispers rose in the corners. They didn't even try to hide them. She showed up. I thought she was gone for good. Must have heard there's money. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking, slow, steady, spine like steel, even as every step felt like I was being dragged backward in time. And then I saw them, Vanessa and Trevor, standing near the front like they belonged to a more polished breed of grief. Vanessa in a tailored black dress, pearls that caught the light with every flick of her wrist. Her makeup was flawless, grief painted on with care. Not enough to smear, just enough to be noticed. Trevor looked the same as ever, cold, controlled. His tie knotted too tightly, as if sorrow could be strangled into silence. Vanessa's eyes met mine. For a moment, something flickered, shock maybe, or disappointment that I didn't stay buried. Then her lips curved, slow, sharp. Well, well, she said, just loud enough for the nearest pews to hear. Look who crawled out of Mobile. Trevor let out a low chuckle, but his eyes stayed hard. Guess the prodigal daughter thinks there's an inheritance left. I said nothing. I didn't come here to answer their questions or defend myself to people who never listen the first time. I didn't come for drama. I didn't come for closure. I came because my son looked me in the eyes and said, maybe he left something for you. So I kept walking past their perfectly curated mourning, their performative sorrow, and slid into the last pew, far in the back, where no one would have to see me if they didn't want it. Mason followed without a word. He didn't let go of my hand, but his grip tightened. I could feel it, the tension in his little fingers, the silence he understood too well for a boy his age. I leaned down, slightly whispered, "It's okay, baby. We're just here to sit." But it wasn't okay. Not really. Because the moment I sat down, I realized something chilling. Not one person had looked at me with recognition. Not as a sister. Not as a daughter. Not even as a human being. To them, I was already erased. The preacher cleared his throat at the front of the chapel. His voice echoed, slightly, bouncing off the wooden beams like it was trying to sound solemn, but landing hollow. Mason sat close to me, his shoulder brushing mine. His fingers hadn't loosened. I didn't look around. I didn't want to see the faces of people who used to watch me open Christmas gifts or blow out birthday candles, now staring like I was the stain on a photograph they'd been meaning to crop. The service began with prayer. Words like peace and forgiveness were tossed around like they didn't know how much blood silence could spill. Then came the eulogies. First, a former business partner spoke about integrity. Thomas Harper believed in responsibility. He always said you reap what you sow. A few quiet nods followed, not at the words, at the memory of a man who worshipped control. Then Trevor stood. He spoke of childhood, backyard barbecues, fishing trips, helping their father with the ledger books in the study. Vanessa followed, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "He was the one person who always believed in me," she said, wiping away a tear that never quite made it out of her eye. "He gave me everything I have." I believed her. Through it all, not once was I mentioned. Not as a daughter, not even as a footnote. It was like I had never existed. Like the woman who once called him dad had been edited out of the story with clean, calculated precision. They skipped over my entire childhood. My mother's death. The birthdays I spent alone. The night I showed up on his doorstep with Mason in my arms. Vanessa's voice rose slightly. He loved this family. Every decision he made for us. I swallowed hard. The irony clawed at my throat. Mason leaned his head against my shoulder, silent. I let my cheek rest on his curls, and for a moment I stopped trying to pretend I was unmoved. I wasn't crying, not because I didn't want to, but because I had cried every tear I had to give years ago. Outside that porch, inside that motel, in the bathroom at work on nights, when Mason was sick and I couldn't afford medicine. Now I just listened, to the sound of a story where I was the ghost, to the polite applause that followed every sterilized memory, and to the thudding silence where my name used to belong. When the service ended, the room began to shift. People stood. Coats were gathered. A few passed by our pew. Some nodded stiffly. Others didn't look at me at all. Vanessa brushed past like I wasn't even there. Her perfume lingered like smoke, sweet, cloying, full of poison. Trevor paused, looked me dead in the eye. His voice low clipped. "Didn't think you had the guts to show up." I met his gaze steady. "Neither did I replied. He smirked. "Cold. Empty. Don't get comfortable. This isn't your story anymore." And then he walked off, as if the last 10 years were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. I sat frozen. Mason's head still rested on my arm, his breath steady, my hand wrapped around his, like it was the only real thing left in the room. But they didn't know. I wasn't there to be in their story. I was there to finish it. The Harper house hadn't changed. Same white columns, same red brick, same ivy creeping up the porch railing like it was trying to choke the past into silence. But stepping through the front door after 10 years felt like walking into a freezer. Everything looked polished, curated, as if grief had been staged like furniture for sale. Voices drifted from the parlor, low and lacquered with false sympathy. Laughter, even. Not the kind that heals, the kind that pretends nothing had ever been broken. Mason held my hand tighter. Inside, I recognized most of the faces. Old neighbors, distant cousins, men my father once played poker with. Not one of them looked directly at me. Conversations dipped to whispers when I entered the room. Eyes slid away. Some stared with thin smiles that didn't reach their eyes. And then I saw Vanessa. She stood near the fireplace, swirling a glass of white wine in a way that made it look like a trophy. Her dress still perfect, not a wrinkle out of place. Mourning as performance art. Next to her, Trevor leaned against the mantel, one hand tucked in his pocket, the other holding a glass of red. Casual, relaxed, like this wasn't a funeral but a victory party. When their eyes met mine, Trevor smirked. "Well, this won't take long," he muttered to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She got cut out years ago." A few people chuckled, awkward, uneasy. Others turned away quickly, pretending to admire the molding on the ceiling or the floor beneath their shoes. I didn't flinch. I didn't respond. I just stepped further in and kept my coat on, even though the fire was crackling nearby. Something in me didn't want to be warm. Not here. Not among them. Mason stayed close. His eyes scanned the room. Not in fear, but with the cautious attention of a boy who had grown up reading tension like weather patterns. He didn't say a word, but I could feel his thoughts moving like wind through tall grass. We found a seat near the back of the parlor, far from the fire, far from the Harper heirs. I let my gaze wander the room. The walls were lined with photographs, dozens of them, framed memories from years gone by. Vanessa in her college graduation gown, Trevor on a fishing boat, family vacations in Hilton Head, Christmas parties, weddings. Not a single photo of me. Not from childhood. Not from school. Not from the early years when we all shared a last name like it meant something. I wasn't surprised. I'd been erased with precision, surgically removed from their story, like a tumor they were embarrassed to admit had ever grown in their bloodline. Vanessa caught my eye. She smiled, but not kindly. Her expression was territorial, like I'd just walked into her castle uninvited. "You can sit, Elaine," she said sweetly, voice coated in sugar and arsenic. "But don't expect a chapter." I gave her nothing, just a steady stare. No heat, no weakness. And that was when I noticed Mason watching her, watching everything, still as a stone but alert. He wasn't confused. He wasn't scared. He was waiting, like something important hadn't happened yet. And somehow, I knew he was right. The front door creaked open again. The room fell into a hush, not the respectful kind, but the wary silence of people who knew they were about to be interrupted by something inconvenient. Franklin Ellis stepped in with the calm of a man who had seen too many families unravel behind closed doors. His gray suit was crisp, shoes polished to the point of defiance. In one arm, he held a smooth cedar box. In the other, his leather briefcase, worn but dignified. Vanessa barely glanced up from her wine. Trevor looked at his watch, annoyed. "Thank you all for being here," Ellis said, voice low but clear. "Per Mr. Thomas Harper's written instructions, we will begin with a video message, before proceeding to the formal reading of the will." The temperature in the room shifted. "A video?" Vanessa scoffed, her lip curling. "Seriously? What is this reality TV?" Trevor leaned closer to her. "Let's just get through this. I've got a flight in 3 hours. But Franklin didn't flinch. He stepped past them, walked to the center of the parlor, and gently placed the cedar box on the coffee table. Then he set the briefcase beside it and began to undo the latches. "It was your father's express wish," he said, glancing up at no one in particular, "that this message be seen by all immediate family before any legal documents are addressed." Vanessa rolled her eyes. Of course it was. Trevor muttered something that sounded like waste of time, but a few of the cousins leaned forward. Curiosity, even among people trained to be indifferent, has a way of bending spines. I didn't move, but Mason did. He sat up straighter, his hand still resting on mine. I looked down at him. His face was lit by something, quiet but unmistakable. Hope. Not the reckless kind. The kind that waits in silence. That survives without proof. That still believes a father might speak the words he never said in life, now that he had nothing left to lose. Franklin opened the cedar box. Inside was a small monitor. He lifted it carefully and placed it on the table, connecting a drive to the side. The screen flickered. Once, then again, before humming to life. The room dimmed around it. And then, there he was, Thomas Harper Sr. older, thinner, shoulders that used to square like steel now slumped under invisible weight. His hair was more silver than gray, eyes shadowed with time and something deeper, regret maybe. He sat at his old desk, the same one that used to be off-limits to us as kids. Behind him, the oil painting of the Mississippi marsh still hung, unchanged, like a witness to everything that went unspoken. He looked straight into the camera. "If Elaine is watching this," he began, voice low, gravel thick with age, "then I suppose I waited too long." The room stopped breathing. "I owe you the apology I never gave." Vanessa shifted. Trevor sat forward slightly. A wine glass clinked against porcelain, but no one spoke, not even me. I just listened, because for the first time in a decade he was finally speaking to me. "If Elaine is watching this," my father said again, slower this time. Then I suppose I waited too long. He shifted slightly in his chair, fingers twitching in his lap. A nervous tick I had never seen before. I was wrong, he said. I judged you for leaving a marriage I didn't understand. I thought you were weak. I thought you were reckless. I let myself believe what was easiest because I didn't want to ask the questions that would force me to see the truth. My breath hitched. Across the room, someone exhaled too loudly. A chair creaked. I told myself I was teaching you responsibility, that I was setting boundaries, that I was being strong. He looked down, swallowed, then looked back at the camera. But the truth is, Elaine, I was punishing you. The room had gone still, the kind of still that makes your heartbeat sound like thunder. I punished you for leaving, for walking away from pain, for choosing yourself when I had never taught you how. I couldn't move. Mason's small hand slid into mine again. He didn't squeeze. He didn't look up, but I felt his breath catch, felt the weight of everything that was never supposed to be said, finally being said by a man who once locked me out in the cold. When you came to my door that night, he paused, shaking his head, bruised, shaking, with your son in your arms. I should have opened the door. I should have said, "Come inside, you're safe now." But instead, I closed it. I let pride speak louder than love. Tears blurred the screen. I blinked hard, but it didn't matter. They came anyway. Hot, fast, not loud, just real. I told myself you didn't need me, that you were making your bed. But I was wrong. You were building something better. His voice softened, cracked at the edges. And then, a few years ago, Mr. Green came by with an envelope. Said it was from a friend. Said it was to help cover the winter heating bill. He smiled faintly, not with joy, but with recognition. The handwriting, the envelope. I knew it was you. Across the room, I felt something shift. A gasp, a glance. You sent money. Every month. Quietly. No credit. No contact. You took care of me, even when I gave you nothing in return. Even when I pretended you didn't exist, you never stopped being my daughter. He looked directly into the camera then, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a recording. It felt like he was there. I'm sorry, Elaine. He took a long, shaky breath. I watched you from a distance. Mr. Green would tell me things about the library, about Mason. He said he was a bright one. Said he looked at the world like you do, patient, quiet, observant. I closed my eyes. For just a second, let myself feel it. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said. But if I can leave you anything, let it be this. He leaned forward. I was wrong. You were right. You did what I couldn't do. You protected your child. You walked away from violence. And you built something better. Silence rang louder than his voice now. I don't want to be remembered as the man who turned his back on his daughter. He looked down. So, I've changed the will. Gasps, audible now, like birds startled from a tree. They don't know yet, he added, his voice steady, but they will. I heard Vanessa shift sharply. Trevor's jaw clenched so tight, I could feel it from across the room. But I didn't look away. All I ever wanted, my father said softly, was to be proud of my children. He smiled, a tired, honest smile. And I am. I'm proud of you, Elaine, of the woman you became when I wasn't looking. The screen flickered. Tell Mason thank you, he added, for giving me one last chance to be a father, even if it was from a distance. Then the screen went black, and in that moment, not a single person in the room made a sound. Not Vanessa, not Trevor, not me, because for the first time in 10 years, I heard my father, loud and clear. The screen had barely gone dark when the murmurs began. They rippled through the room like a current, confusion, disbelief, quiet panic. A cousin whispered something to his wife. Someone else cursed under their breath. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the sudden stench of fear. But Franklin Ellis didn't wait for silence. He adjusted his glasses with the calm of a man who had done this 100 times, then opened the leather folder on his lap. The video, he said, was intended to provide personal context. What follows now is the legally binding revised last will and testament of Thomas Harper Sr., certified and filed with the East Baton Rouge Clerk of Court. Vanessa let out a sharp breath through her nose, a sound more insulted than wounded. Trevor folded his arms and leaned back, smug again. That video doesn't change anything, he muttered. We all know what's coming. But Franklin's voice remained steady. To my daughter, Elaine Harper, he began. I leave the Harper family residence located at 2215 Bayfield Road, along with all its contents and surrounding land. The room turned. Every head, every eye, every jaw that hadn't already dropped now. My breath froze in my chest. Mason turned to me, his eyes wide. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My hand was still resting in his, fingers numb. In addition, Franklin continued, flipping to the next page, I leave to Elaine Harper the sum of $250,000 in liquid assets, an entirety of my remaining retirement savings, totaling an additional $74,000. Silence, thicker than grief, sharper than envy. I could hear hearts pounding behind teeth. But Franklin wasn't finished. And to her son, Mason Harper, he said, glancing toward us, I leave a dedicated college education trust in the amount of $100,000. Mason blinked. He looked up at me, mouth slightly open. I was still trying to breathe. Then came the turn. Franklin flipped to the final page, his tone unchanged. To my son, Trevor Harper, and to my daughter, Vanessa Harper, I leave the following. They both sat forward, chins raised. A collection of family photo albums, my old military compass, and the Bible gifted to me by my mother upon my 18th birthday. A gasp broke loose from somewhere across the room. Vanessa shot to her feet. What? Her voice cracked like glass under pressure. That's not possible. Franklin looked up unbothered. There is no mistake. Your father amended the will 2 years ago. It is signed, witnessed, notarized, and officially recorded. Trevor stood next. His face had turned a color I'd never seen on him before, something between red and ash. He was sick, he snapped. He didn't know what he was doing. Franklin didn't even blink. Your father was of sound mind at the time of amendment. There is no medical record of cognitive decline until 8 months after the date of signing. He closed the folder with a soft but final snap. But he wasn't done. There is also, he said, reaching into a side pocket of the folder, a handwritten addendum. A note he asked me to read aloud, separate from the legal documentation. Vanessa looked like she'd just swallowed glass. Franklin unfolded the paper and read, slower now. Let them remember who showed up when it mattered. Let them remember who stayed quiet, but never stopped loving. This house belongs to the one person who never asked for anything and gave anyway. Vanessa's wine glass shook in her hand. The stem tapped once, twice, against the sideboard. Then she stormed out of the room. No words, no fury, just the sound of her heels clicking like gunshots across the hardwood floor. Trevor followed a second later, slower, but burning from the inside out. His eyes met mine before he reached the door. There was no rage, no threat, only disbelief. They had come to claim a legacy and found themselves disinherited. You had to have tricked him. Vanessa's voice sliced through the silence as she reappeared in the doorway, breathless and livid, wine glass still clutched in her trembling hand. There's no way, she spat, stepping forward, eyes blazing. There is no way he would have changed the will on his own. You manipulated him, Elaine. You always knew how to get sympathy. I didn't move. I didn't answer. The words didn't even sting. Because this time they weren't wrapped in power. They were wrapped in panic. You don't deserve this, she shouted. After everything you did to this family, after everything you took, How dare you come back here acting like some silent saint? Her voice cracked. Mason flinched beside me. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Not to protect him, just to remind myself I was still here, grounded. Hull! Trevor stepped forward now. His tone wasn't sharp like hers. It was low, coiled, more dangerous. We'll challenge it, he said quietly. There's no way this holds. He was confused. He was sick. The courts will see that. Franklin Ellis didn't even sigh. He just pulled out another document from the folder, held it up calmly, and said, Your father's was amended 26 months before his passing. At the time, he passed a formal psychological evaluation by a licensed physician. The file is signed, notarized, and on record with the court. Trevor's mouth opened, then closed. There was no angle left to strike from. Franklin's voice lowered a notch. Not cruel, just final. There is no legal ground for contesting this will. Silence again. But it wasn't the silence of confusion this time. It was the silence of collapse. Vanessa stood frozen in place, her breathing uneven. She looked like she didn't know whether to scream or fall to her knees. Her hand opened, and the wine glass touched the sideboard with a dull thud. This is a joke, she said, more to herself than anyone else. It's a goddamn joke. She looked around the room, as if someone might still be on her side. But the cousins had gone quiet. The old family friends were slipping away one by one, murmuring excuses, their coats already on. No one was looking at her now. And that's when I realized they weren't looking at me out of hate anymore. They were avoiding my gaze, out of shame. Vanessa turned sharply and left the room without another word. Trevor hesitated. For half a second, I saw something behind his eyes. Something like a flicker of recognition, maybe even guilt. But it was gone before it could land. He turned and followed his sister, footsteps echoing off the floor as he disappeared down the hall. And just like that, the room emptied. The people who once erased me now couldn't bear to stand in my presence. They thought they had buried me 10 years ago, thought they had edited me out of every chapter. But now they were the ones retreating. And I was still here. Hull! The room was still. Not awkward, not tense, just still. Like a long breath finally exhaled after years of being held. I didn't move. Mason sat beside me, quiet, his hand still resting in mine, though his grip had loosened. He didn't look scared anymore, just calm. Everyone else was gone. The murmurs had faded down the hallway. Doors had clicked shut. Coats had been slipped on in shame. They had all vanished, like smoke after the fire burns out. I rose slowly. My knees felt heavier than they should have, but my steps were sure. I walked to the corner of the parlor where it sat. The old leather chair, still tucked beneath the bay window, still faded at the arms, still creaking at the joints, still shaped by the weight of a man who used to call it his throne. It had been off limits my whole childhood. That chair belonged to Dad and no one else. I stood in front of it for a moment, just looking. It hadn't changed, but I had. I reached down and brushed my fingertips along the top edge, gently like I was closing a book. Goodbye, Dad, I whispered. And then, softer still, I forgive you. The words didn't choke in my throat. They didn't twist or sting or make my heart clench. They just landed. Soft, final, like they had been waiting to be spoken, not for his sake, but for mine. Behind me, I heard Mason shift, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fireplace crackled quietly. Its glow spilled out over the floor, over the worn chair, over the room that once held everything that broke me, and now held nothing but light. I turned to look around one last time. The photos on the walls, the scuffs on the baseboards, the cracks in the molding. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a place that had cast me out. It felt like a home that had finally let me in. Some ghosts don't haunt. They just wait for the right words. And now I had finally said mine. Weeks passed. The house had grown quiet in a new way, no longer the hush of tension, but the calm that comes after a storm has pulled every nail loose and left only sunlight behind. Mason had claimed the sunroom. Every morning, I found him there, sitting cross-legged by the tall windows, sketchbook open on his lap, tongue pressed to the corner of his lip in deep concentration. He drew birds mostly just like always, but they looked freer now. The wings wider, the sky bigger. Sometimes his laughter would ring down the hall, light, bright, filling spaces that used to ache. One morning, as I poured coffee into the same chipped mug that used to belong to my father, I heard the mail slot rattle. I stepped to the door and found a single white envelope on the floor. No return address, but the handwriting. I knew it instantly. Walter Green. I carried it to the kitchen table with both hands, sat down, took a breath, then opened it. Inside was a single note, handwritten. Rachel, the day your father figured out it was you sending the money, I'd never seen him look so small. He stood on the porch for 10 minutes after I told him. Didn't say a word, just stared at the mailbox like it owed him an explanation. He carried that truth with him every single day after that. He didn't talk about it much, but I saw it, in his hands, in the way he looked out at the road. I think that's when he started writing the letter to you, the one you saw. He may have failed you once, but I think, in the end, he wanted to fail forward. Thought you should know. W.G. I folded the letter gently and stood up, stepped out onto the front porch, where the late morning sun had just begun to push through the oak trees that lined the yard. Mason sat on the top step, sketching a hawk mid-dive, pencil dark and swift across the page. I looked out over the lawn, green, wide, quiet, then said it out loud, not to anyone in particular, but because it needed to be said. He saw me in the end. Mason glanced up, but didn't ask. He didn't need to. The birds chirped above us. The air was warm, and I knew the girl they had erased hadn't disappeared. She'd just been waiting for the truth to find its way home.